He was supposed to be Putin's favorite puppet. The man who would say, "How high?" whenever Putin told him to jump. But something has changed about Belarusian dictator Aleksandr Lukashenko. Putin has told him to jump once more, but the response wasn't what Russia's leader expected. Lukashenko has done the unthinkable. He has humiliated Putin by backing down to threats that Ukraine made. What we have now is the story of a dictator who is waking up to the fact that he never wanted to accept Russia can't protect Belarus. And that means Putin can't force Lukashenko into war. Putin has been trying to pile on the pressure. As Russia struggles to do much of anything in Ukraine, Putin has been making it very clear to Lukashenko that the once faithful dog must bite when commanded. As the Kyiv Post reported on June 25th, Putin has been ramping up the pressure on the closest ally that he has left in Europe. Russia wants Belarus to play a bigger part in Putin's war. That includes allowing Russia to launch more drones from Belarusian territory, and perhaps even to open up a new front, using the Belarusian military for Ukraine to contend with. But Lukashenko hasn't been fast enough to move for Putin's liking. That has led to Putin telling his lapdog that Belarus will receive less financial support from Moscow if it doesn't cooperate with everything that Putin demands. That's a grave threat. Over 40% of Belarus's total exports, along with 55% of its imports, are linked to Russia. And for a minute there, it looked like Lukashenko was going to acquiesce to Putin's demands. Even though he has been calling for peace between Russia and Ukraine, which itself was a massive turnaround from the days that Lukashenko argued that Russia could crush Ukraine, the Belarusian dictator has claimed that we will be next to Russia, while threatening that this war will be completely different if Ukraine tries to drag Belarus into the fight. But these are the words of a very scared man. And we can see that from Lukashenko's moves when Ukraine decided to ramp up some pressure of its own. As Putin was trying to push Lukashenko into the war, Ukraine delivered a warning. Lukashenko had 1 week to shut down the Russian drone relays stationed on Belarusian territory, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared on June 19th. There is no need for extra words. On his towers there are relay stations, Russian relay stations, Belarusian. What difference does it make? Zelensky said, noting that these relays have been used to direct Russian drones to Ukrainian civilians. Shut them down, Zelensky said, taking a more aggressive tone toward Lukashenko than we've seen at any other point during the war. Ukraine's president gave Lukashenko a week. That warning prompted Putin's pressure, and for Lukashenko he faced a nightmare situation. No longer able to appease Putin with words and some relay stations, the dictator found himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. Should he crumble under Russian or Ukrainian pressure? We got our answer on June 24th. That's the date that the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, revealed that Lukashenko has made a big move that has humiliated Putin and made Russia's leader realize just how limited the extent of his reach really is. The puppet turned off the signal repeaters stationed along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, and he did it at least 2 days earlier than the deadline Zelensky set. This is fear. Lukashenko realizes that he should be terrified of Ukraine, and despite all of his bluster, this one move has made it very clear that the dictator doesn't want to get involved in Putin's war. There are still things that remain to be seen. We know the relay stations have ceased their operations, but we don't know if they've been torn down altogether. For now, stopping them is enough because of the message that it sends. Lukashenko doesn't want to anger Zelensky more than he already has. And what we're seeing now is a dictator who is hedging his bets rather than throwing all of his support behind Putin. As insane as Lukashenko may sometimes seem, he is at least shrewd enough to be paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine right now. For a man who is desperate to retain his grip on power in Belarus, what he sees shows him that it's not a good idea to get on Ukraine's bad side. Lukashenko is watching as Russia continues to sacrifice over 30,000 of its soldiers every month to a spring and summer offensive that was supposed to destroy Ukraine, but has ended up showcasing the weakness of the Russian military. Lukashenko would likely have seen the ISW data, which tells us that Russia actively lost control of 280 square kilometers in May, only gaining 40 in the process. Russia is in the red. It's Ukraine that keeps on coming out on top for net territory gains, which it also achieved in April. And that tells Belarus's dictator that Russia isn't the all-conquering power that he has so long claimed it to be. Russia is fragile, and Lukashenko knows that Ukraine is the reason why. Lukashenko also sees what terrifies him the most: Ukrainian long-range drones conducting strikes all over Russia. Over the past month or so, St. Petersburg has burned due to Ukrainian drones. Moscow has been hit several times. These are the Russian seats of power and the regions that Putin so desperately wants to shield from the war, yet Ukraine strikes them over and over again. Then there's Belarus, with no real drone defenses, basically nothing to protect it against the swarms of Ukrainian drones should Zelensky choose to unleash them. What Lukashenko really sees is that Russia is losing the war, and not only is Lukashenko seeing this, but he's also saying it. Belarus's dictator has told foreign media that he no longer believes that Russia can win the war militarily. Granted, he said the same thing about Ukraine, suggesting the two sides had reached a stalemate, but this is still a massive leap from the days when Lukashenko was gung-ho about Putin and the inevitable collapse of Ukraine. In 2022, Lukashenko allowed Russia to invade Ukraine from Belarusian territory. Now he won't even keep the signal relays up and running, all because Zelensky gave him a deadline. Lukashenko has transformed from one of Putin's most ardent supporters to somebody who crumbles to Ukrainian pressure. But if you've been paying attention to other things that are happening in Belarus, you may be wondering if this is all real. As he crumbles to Ukraine, Lukashenko has been making other moves that contradict the idea that he's finally saying no to Putin. But these moves aren't as they seem. It may look like Lukashenko is gearing up to join Putin's war. However, what he's really doing will shock you and will also reveal to Putin that at the end of the day, Lukashenko is always going to turn to whoever is best at keeping him in power. Before we explore all of that, this is a reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If this is the kind of insight that you want to see, then make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. So we're seeing a contradiction in the things that Lukashenko is doing. On the one hand, he's caving to Ukrainian pressure and shutting down the relay stations. But on the other hand, there's no denying the evidence of our own eyes. Belarus is remilitarizing at a scale that we've yet to see during Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The Atlantic Council reported on this on June 25th, under a headline that suggests that Lukashenko is actually preparing to get involved in the war. We also know that Putin has made a big deal about transferring tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, though that has yet to be independently verified, despite Belarus and Russia teaming up for joint nuclear drills on Belarusian territory back in May. Belarus is also removing the political, legal, and military barriers that limit its involvement in Putin's war, which all seem on the surface to be bad signs. Lukashenko himself has announced selective mobilization in Belarus, again in May, which again is seen as preparations for a potential war. But perhaps the biggest warning comes from a report that Belarus's opposition in exile has submitted to Ukraine's foreign ministry. That report highlighted 8 key indicators that Lukashenko is indeed gearing up for war, which include a military doctrine passed in 2024 that allows for preemptive strikes, and a 1.5-fold increase in the number of soldiers contracted to the Belarusian army since 2022. All of this points to the exact opposite of what we've just been telling you, so what gives? How can Belarus be backing down to Ukraine when it's clearly preparing for war? All is not as it seems. There's no denying what Lukashenko is doing to strengthen the Belarusian military. However, he isn't doing all of this to prepare for war with Ukraine. There's another reason, and it all comes down to the type of man that Lukashenko is. He's a dictator. And as much of a puppet as he's been for Putin for so many years, if there's one thing that dictators value more than alliances, it's the power that they hold in their countries. The reality of the Belarusian military buildup is that it doesn't really matter anywhere near as much as it might seem, at least where Ukraine is concerned. Belarus is a military minnow. Selective mobilization won't change that. The country has always maintained a small army, most likely because Lukashenko believed that he could always rely on Russia to defend his territory if it ever came under threat. Or perhaps more accurately, he could rely on Putin to keep him in power. That's why we've seen so much integration between the Russian and Belarusian militaries over the last few years. Lukashenko truly believed that he was betting on the right horse when Putin launched his invasion. Then the last 4+ years happened and Lukashenko experienced a very rude awakening. So when we watch as Belarus builds up its military, we shouldn't be looking at what's happening from the perspective that Lukashenko is preparing to join Putin in Ukraine. That would be suicide, both for Belarus's tiny military and the country itself. No, what Lukashenko is really doing here is what all dictators of smaller countries do when the stuff hits the fan and their great protectors expose themselves. Lukashenko is protecting himself. The Belarusian dictator sees how badly the Ukraine war is going for Russia, and he realizes that his number one priority right now is to protect himself. That's the reason for the selective mobilization and military buildup. Lukashenko is under no illusion that his people love him. There's a reason why his main opposition has been forced into exile, which is that Lukashenko knows that it wouldn't take much for them to build up the support needed to boot him out of power if they were in Belarus. Now that he sees that Russia is failing as badly as it is in Ukraine, remember 30,000 plus casualties per month and actively losing territory to Ukraine, Lukashenko isn't getting ready to join Putin in his invasion. He's preparing the Belarusian military to protect himself when everything goes sideways. And there's more evidence for this point of view than you might think. For a start, despite all of his outward support for Putin, Lukashenko hasn't allowed Russia to invade via Belarusian territory since the early days of the invasion. For over 4 years, there have been no Belarusian soldiers in Ukraine. Lukashenko didn't make the leap to war when things were going comparatively well for Russia, and he isn't going to do it now that he sees that Russia is losing. Then there's that hedging that we talked about earlier. Shutting down the relay stations is an example. That's Lukashenko's way of telling Ukraine that he doesn't want Belarus to seem like a threat. Even before that shutdown, June 16th brought with it the news that Lukashenko had outright said that Belarus wasn't a military threat to Ukraine in an interview in which the Belarusian dictator even apologized to Zelensky for comments that he'd made in the past. There's also the big deal to consider. Back in March, there was a sudden upswing in diplomatic relations between the US and Belarus. Lukashenko claimed that he'd received an invite to speak to US President Donald Trump to discuss a big deal amidst the US easing sanctions on Belarus. Fast forward to the end of May, and there are rumblings that Lukashenko may put in an appearance during one of the meetings of the Board of Peace that Trump has created. This defrosting of the Belarus-US relationship shows us that Lukashenko is trying to build ties with the West, which is unforgivable as far as Putin is concerned. Lukashenko is supposed to be a lapdog, but all of these moves show Putin that the dictator who has called Russia's president his big brother is now looking to save his own skin rather than do what Russia tells him to do. Lukashenko is hedging because he knows that entering the war with Ukraine would be disastrous for him and his country. Lukashenko is right. Belarus wouldn't stand a chance. We told you earlier that Belarus is a military minnow. That's especially the case when comparing the nation to Ukraine. Belarusian forces have no real combat experience, and Lukashenko will be throwing them to the wolves in Ukraine against troops that have been fighting since 2022. Lukashenko knows that better than anyone. In the same interview where he apologized to Zelensky for his past remarks, he admitted that Belarus is vulnerable. That's a two-toned confession. It's Lukashenko saying that he knows the Belarusian army can't stand up to Ukraine, and that Russia can't protect his territory or his presidency if he gets involved in the war. On the military front, Belarus has no chance. Its active military of 63,000 and its 365,400 reserves are dwarfed by Ukraine's active military of 900,000 alone, and that's before we throw 4 million reserves into the mix. Belarus doesn't come out on top in any department, be it land, sea or air, and worst of all for Lukashenko, he knows that Ukraine's drones would do a real number on his country. He's seen Ukraine's drones strike all over Russia, turning the country's size into a major weakness in the process. Belarus is tiny in comparison to Russia, but that also makes it more compact. Every industrial center in Belarus would become a target for Ukraine's drones, and they would strike with impunity against a nation that has such a Russia-centric economy that it would collapse as its output declined and new sanctions came pouring in. Lukashenko doesn't want Ukraine's smoke, and he no longer believes that Russia can protect him. Russia is trying to convince Lukashenko that he should stick with Putin. On June 23rd, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov declared that Russia would protect Belarus with a full range of measures if the time came, just like it protected the leaders of Venezuela, Syria, and Iran when they came under threat. Oh wait, those leaders are all gone. Lukashenko has seen just how well Russia protects its allies, and he knows that he'd suffer the same fate if he poked the Ukrainian bear by turning the relays back on and sending his military into the war. So we see the true root of all Lukashenko's erratic behavior over the last few months. Here we have a leader who has never been much of a diplomat, attempting to walk a tightrope between Russia and Ukraine, and he's not doing it very well. He'll blare about supporting Putin in one breath, then apologize to Zelensky in the next. He talks about how Belarus would be and deliver warnings to Ukraine not to drag his country into war, then he'll turn off signal relays when Zelensky demands it. And as all of this contradictory behavior points to a dictator in crisis, it all comes back to one simple fact, that Lukashenko is simply trying to save his own skin. After all, he knows that entering Ukraine would be a catastrophe. Not just for his military, but for his entire future as Belarus's dictator. On June 26, UA.News revealed that political analyst Igor Tishkevich has highlighted how practically nobody in Belarus wants anything to do with Putin's war, and they haven't since the start. Tishkevich claims that between 55 and 60% of Belarusians categorically oppose any sort of involvement of the Belarusian military in the Ukraine war. Only 5 to 7% actively support such a scenario, which tells us all we need to know about Lukashenko's actions. He's managed to maintain his grip on power by relying on Russia for so many years. As Russia weakens, Lukashenko has to start listening to people, and they are telling him that they will not accept the inevitable bloodshed that would stain their lives if Lukashenko does what Putin wants him to do. If Belarus goes to war, it seems very likely that Lukashenko would have an uprising on his hands. That's the real reason behind the Belarusian military buildup. It's all about keeping Lukashenko in power, as he desperately claws for a way out of the hole he dug for himself when he threw his support behind Russia in 2022. Ukraine has made Belarus fear Kyiv more than Moscow. That is Putin's nightmare scenario, because it shows him that even the country that is most easily within reach of his sphere of influence is turning its back on Russia's demands. In an ideal world, this would be the wake-up call that Putin needs to realize that his Ukraine invasion is lost, but it won't be. As the ISW reports, high-ranking Kremlin officials are reiterating their unwillingness to negotiate with Ukraine due to some strange sort of confidence, faked or otherwise, in the ability of Russia's forces to achieve Putin's objectives in Ukraine. The Kremlin is living in la-la land if it thinks that Russia is winning in Ukraine. And even a dictator as crazy and Russia-dependent as Lukashenko can see it. Ukraine won't let its guard down. It'll continue to make sure how badly things will go for Lukashenko if he tries to go on the warpath. But Putin has to face up to the fact that relying on a dictator as paranoid about holding onto power as he is was never a smart move. And Putin has plenty of problems besides Lukashenko showing his fear of Ukraine. Russia itself is on the ropes, and not just in Ukraine. Something devastating has broken inside the country, and Russia may never be able to recover. Find out what by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to hit subscribe so that you can see more analysis from the military show. And thank you for watching.